The most honest assessment of your abilities never comes from your friends. It comes from your deadliest enemies. During World War II, the arrogant Nazi war machine was forced to face the Allies. But what did German generals actually think of the American, British, and Soviet forces? The reality defies everything you've read in history books. Behind closed doors, their opinions swung from racial disgust to absolute terror, hiding dark truths and historical secrets that still shape modern warfare today. Let's step inside the minds of the enemy. Of all the Allied commanders, there was one who instantly earned the grudging respect of the German High Command, General George S. Patton. To the Germans, Patton wasn't just an enemy, he was a kindred spirit. His military philosophy of constant movement, rapid advances, and overwhelming aggression was a mirror image of their own blitzkrieg tactics. Heinz Guderian, the mastermind behind Germany's armored warfare, couldn't help but admire his American counterpart, stating that, from the standpoint of a tank specialist, Patton acted exactly as he would have done had he been in his place. However, this admiration came with a heavy dose of German condescension. While they praised Patton's tactical brilliance, many German officers were quick to dismiss the broader American war effort. They argued that American victories were not born of superior military skill, but of overwhelming material wealth. To the German High Command, the Americans were simply buying their way to victory with mountains of money, steel, and endless convoys of supplies. The Germans openly mocked the US military, claiming they only won because of their vast industrial might and supply lines that never seemed to run dry. But this arrogance, this deep-seated disregard for the mechanics of supply, was the very fatal flaw in the Nazi military mindset. Pragmatic military minds understand a brutal truth. Wars are not decided solely by courage or flashy tactical maneuvers on a map. They are decided by logistics. It is no coincidence that many historians argue Germany wasn't just defeated by George Patton or Dwight D. Eisenhower. They were ultimately crushed by three invisible generals: General Motors, General Electric, and General Mills. The fact that the United States could manufacture and transport millions of tons of ammunition, vehicles, and fuel across a perilous ocean to feed a colossal war machine every single day, that wasn't luck, and it certainly wasn't cheating. It was the absolute pinnacle of grand strategy. While German commanders were busy drawing brilliant tactical flanking maneuvers on their maps, their actual tanks were sputtering to a halt, completely out of gas. When German soldiers were freezing to death in the snow because they lacked basic winter gear, the brutal reality finally set in. The romanticized, fast-paced glory of the Blitzkrieg could never outlast the ruthless, grinding power of American industrial assembly lines. While the Germans ultimately misjudged the relentless power of American logistics, their perspective on the British military was defined by an entirely different kind of paradox. You might assume the German war machine viewed their British adversaries as mere pushovers, but the reality was a stark, almost brutal division of respect. German assessments consistently separated the British soldier from the British commander. They admired the men on the ground, but held deep contempt for the leadership. The Germans held a profound respect for the resilience, toughness, and stubborn combat spirit of the everyday British soldier. Yet, they viewed the British High Command as paralyzed by caution. In the lightning-fast era of mechanized warfare, the German generals saw British leadership as hesitant, unimaginative, and painfully slow. General Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, perfectly captured this polarized opinion. Addressing captured British officers after the siege of Tobruk, he bluntly stated, "Gentlemen, you have fought like lions and been led by donkeys." However, there is a deeply ironic twist hidden beneath this German arrogance. Rommel and his peers may have mocked the British High Command as donkeys, but these same German generals were actually devoted students of a British military genius, General Sir Percy Hobart. The devastating blitzkrieg tactics that ripped through Europe were not entirely a German invention. Long before the war broke out, back in the 1920s, it was Hobart who foresaw the future of rapid armored warfare. But because of his unconventional ideas, blunt personality, and lack of aristocratic background, the traditional British military elite, the very donkeys Rommel mocked, shunned Hobart and forced him into early retirement. Across enemy lines, the reaction was the exact opposite. Heinz Guderian, the architect of the German armoured forces, was quietly collecting, translating and studying every single piece of Hobart's discarded writings. Guderian took the British blueprints and transformed them into the core combat doctrine of the Wehrmacht. The tragic price for the British leadership's stubbornness was ultimately paid in blood. In the early years of the conflict, the British army was utterly crushed on the battlefield by the very tactics their own countrymen had invented. The Germans didn't just achieve early victories through superior weaponry. They dominated because they knew how to value and weaponize the brilliant ideas their enemies had foolishly thrown in the trash. While German opinions of British and American forces were complex and deeply nuanced, their view of the Soviet military underwent a dramatic, almost unrecognizable transformation. At the dawn of Operation Barbarossa, the German High Command viewed the Soviet Union as little more than a fragile house of cards. They looked across the eastern border at the Red Army and saw a poorly equipped, badly led force that they believed would simply collapse under the crushing weight of the Wehrmacht. But this outright dismissal was not based on objective military intelligence. It was deeply rooted in Hitler's toxic racial theories. The Germans looked at the Soviet forces through the twisted lens of Untermenschen, viewing them as subhumans. In psychology, this is known as dehumanization, a dark mental mechanism that allows people to shed their moral conscience when destroying their fellow man. However, on the strategic chessboard, dehumanization acts as a deadly poison that completely blinds your judgment. When you slap a label of inherent inferiority on your opponent, you actively strip yourself of the ability to assess their true potential. The German High Command simply refused to believe that these supposedly inferior troops could ever learn from their devastating early defeats, reorganize their ranks, and develop tactics that would eventually choke the German army. Their ideological prejudice created a fatal illusion of invincibility. The profound lesson hidden in this historical misjudgment goes far beyond basic morality. It is a fundamental rule of survival. Arrogance born from prejudice doesn't just make you ruthless, it makes you foolish. By underestimating an opponent based on racial bias and social labels, the German High Command actively opened the door to their own violent destruction. This illusion of superiority was brutally shattered on the battlefield. As the conflict dragged on into the bitter Russian winters, the German perspective evolved from arrogant dismissal to absolute paralyzing fear. The Red Army, though initially caught off guard, demonstrated a terrifying level of resilience. The Battle of Stalingrad became the ultimate graveyard for German arrogance. When Soviet forces successfully encircled, starved, and annihilated an entire German army, any lingering illusions of Soviet inferiority were buried forever in the snow. The Germans were violently forced to reassess everything they thought they knew. Field Marshal Ewald von Kleist perfectly captured this agonizing reality check when he stated, "Having gained combat experience, the Russians became first-class soldiers, and they fought with exceptional perseverance and had astounding endurance." The outright contempt that fueled the early days of the invasion was entirely replaced by a palpable dread. Franz Halder, chief of the German Army High Command, noted with profound alarm that the Russian troops were suddenly fighting with the greatest tenacity and severity. By the time Soviet tanks were rolling through the burning rubble of Berlin, the German generals had learned a devastating lesson. The ideological blindfold had been ripped off, revealing a relentless juggernaut that had not only matched but entirely overwhelmed the so-called master race. Their initial, arrogant prejudice had been utterly crushed by the bloody, unforgiving reality of the Eastern Front. While the sheer brutality of the Eastern Front forced the Germans to acknowledge Soviet power, their seemingly noble respect for the Western Allies requires a much closer look. There is a hidden detail that German commanders completely missed when evaluating the Allied forces, leading to a massive misjudgment of military genius. German generals were frequently astonished by the tactical brilliance of British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. In the sweeping deserts of North Africa, Montgomery seemed to constantly stay one step ahead of the legendary desert fox, Erwin Rommel. The German High Command respected this as pure, visionary, tactical genius. But as one military historian famously quipped, people thought Montgomery was reading Rommel's mind, when in fact, he was reading Rommel's mail. The Germans were completely blind to a weapon far more terrifying than any panzer division: asymmetric information. The Allies had successfully cracked the top-secret German Enigma code. In modern warfare, we are often dazzled by seemingly brilliant, visionary decisions. But the brutal truth is that the winner isn't always the bravest or the smartest. It is often the one who holds data the enemy doesn't know exists. The German commanders were obsessively analyzing the moves on the chessboard, entirely unaware that their opponent could see their secret playbook hidden under the table. This brings us to a second crucial realization about the German perspective. Before we completely buy into this narrative of noble, knightly respect between enemies, we have to look at the actual context. Almost all of these glowing assessments, the high praise for George Patton, the admiration for the British soldier, and the fearful respect for the Red Army, were recorded after the war had ended. These quotes were given by defeated German generals while they were sitting in Allied prisoner-of-war camps. We have to ask ourselves, was this genuine, heartfelt admiration, or was it a psychological defense mechanism? Was it simply the ultimate excuse of the defeated, by praising Patton as the American equivalent of Guderian, or by entirely blaming their defeat on the endless material wealth of the United States and the limitless manpower of the Soviet Union? These German officers were carefully rewriting history to protect their own shattered egos. The underlying message they wanted to leave for the history books was clear: we didn't lose because of poor strategy or military incompetence. We only lost because the enemy had too much money, too many tanks, and successfully copied our own blitzkrieg tactics. In the end, their high praise for the Allied commanders wasn't just an objective military evaluation. It was the perfect psychological shield to cover up their own catastrophic failure before the judges of history. Ultimately, examining how the German High Command viewed the Allies teaches us a lesson that echoes far beyond the battlefields of World War II. It proves that any ideology built on arrogance and any strategy rooted in underestimating your opponent will eventually be paid for in blood. The German war machine blinded itself with racial prejudice and a false sense of superiority. By ignoring the true logistical, tactical, and psychological strengths of the American, British, and Soviet forces, they sealed their own doom. The catastrophic fall of Nazi Germany remains a cold, unforgiving warning for modern military strategists, business executives, and everyday leaders. Prejudice is the most expensive mistake you can make. Your enemy will always be the truest mirror of your own fatal flaws. Which historical twist or shattered illusion from today's video surprised you the most? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden truths of history, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We'll see you in the next one.